Dear friends, welcome to this digital event where NORCAP and the Boston Consulting Group are launching their co-authored report, Empowering Africa's Most Vulnerable, Access to Solar Energy in Complex Crisis. My name is Stig Arild Pettersen, and this event is part of the ONS Digital Conference on Energy. And you're either following us on their website or on Facebook Live. Welcome, and thanks for taking the time to join us in this conversation. We will have a brief presentation of the report before we dive into a panel discussion about the challenges faced and solutions suggested on the topic of access to solar energy for the world's most vulnerable. This event will end at 10 o'clock. First of all, I would like to say welcome to Benedicte Giæver from NORCAP and Arne Sjåtil of Boston Consulting Group. Benedicte is the Executive Director of NORCAP, which is part of the Norwegian Refugee Council and one of the world's largest providers of expertise to the humanitarian, development, and peace-building sectors. Arne represents the energy practice of BCG, which has worked with NORCAP for many years, and with NRC. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you, Stig Arne. Insufficient energy access is a fundamental challenge, harming the world's most vulnerable groups. If the vulnerable are not included, they will fall behind. Yet, when increasing energy access, we must ensure that it is green, and we need to start with ourselves. NORCA provides expertise to our partners in the humanitarian, development, and peace-building sector. And we also do joint programming. In addition, we support and we work together with national and local authorities and institutions, and we support civil society organizations. We are also the biggest provider of global expertise to the energy sector. And there we have seen that clean energy is a key enabler for more resilient and independent communities. So this is the key reason to why, when we had the opportunity to do this work together with Boston Consulting Group, we said, yes, this is something we really need to do. We have tried to set up a report that's holistic thinking, and yet is so detailed that all the different actors can find themselves and see their own roles and how they can carry the work forward. Yes. 600,000 people in Africa are lacking access to energy. This is half of Africa's population. It's countries like South Sudan, Congo, Somalia, and Uganda where you have the highest populations of displaced, and also where you are lacking the most access to clean energy. So these countries are now falling more and more behind when the other countries are developing. Displaced populations are most in need. Over 90% of them can't access electricity or energy at all. And like the rest of us, they require energy for everyday life. But the economic opportunity that access to energy also gives is extremely important for them to carry out their lives with dignity and respect. The Sustainable Development Goal number 7 states that everybody should have access to clean energy by 2030. But the gap is huge, as we can see from the map, and the time is very short. Yes. In the last few years, there's been a global push to see how can one ensure that the actors from the humanitarian, development, and peace-building sector are able to work better together. This is critical in the UN reform. One says we have to set up common objectives and work accordingly. And we believe, and this is what the report also states, by doing that, we can actually ensure to accelerate the access to clean energy. According to our study, there are 3 things that needs to be done. First, we need more investments in clean energy, but also a pooling of funds. Today's financing models, such as the Green Climate Fund, are not set up to cover the most vulnerable countries. They were the ones in the map we saw just before. It is vital that such funds are flexible and can adapt to different contexts. If not, it hinders, rather than helps coordination, long-term investments and transition to clean energy solutions. Second, and this is an extremely important point, we need to ensure that we draw upon the best expertise from these three sectors. And in our report, you can read more about this, but we need to see, what are the humanitarian sector best at? What are the development sector best at? And last but not least, we must not forget the peace-building side of it. You all know how access to water, oil has fueled conflicts, and that is the same when it comes to energy, not to be forgotten. So all these three sectors needs to be brought together in order to have a common lens. And when it comes to the common lens, it's extremely important in terms of de-risking projects. This is what we call the de-risking projects. Because it's only when you have a common analysis, a common understanding of what the needs are on the ground, that you can have a common project and a common approach. And that goes for both international organizations, but we need to have national authorities in place. We need to have the national institutions, and last but not least, we need to have the civil society with us. And that takes time. I think this is one of the key challenges so far, that we are not allowing enough time and invest in these areas in order to bring everybody on board to find that common solution.
It's a daunting challenge that Benedicte has presented. And through our study, we talked to more than 60 leaders of NGOs, international organizations, clean energy companies, governments, and investors. And we firmly believe that now is the time to address this issue. NGOs and UN agencies could lead the way by transitioning existing old diesel generators into solar energy. The technology is ready. The cost of solar panels has come down by a factor of 5 during the past 10 years, and it's better and cheaper than diesel engines. A natural next step would be to extend that energy supply to surrounding service hubs, such as schools, hospitals, community centers, etc. This initial transition could then serve as a catalyst for larger scale developments, such as distributed energy systems or larger solar mini-grids. And it's already happening today. In Malakal in South Sudan is one example of a camp which has already transitioned to solar. In Rwanda, in an area of Rwanda last year, there was a project to develop distributed solar energy. And only within 7 months, the penetration was at 25%. The good news is that a relatively modest investment is sufficient to improve the lives of millions. In our scenario, we estimated that $50 per person, an upfront investment of $50 per person, is sufficient to deliver benefits such as powered schools and hospitals, indoor lighting, refrigerators for medicine, and also power for small companies to develop and grow. There are a set of challenges that needs to be overcome for this to happen, and let me touch on the top 3. First of all, the financing needs to be suitable for solar deployment. Typically, the budgets of NGOs and international organizations are short-cycled, and that does not really fit with the deployment of solar, which typically will have an upfront investment followed by years of community benefits and lower operating cost. As Benedicte alluded to, the funding is there, it's available, but it needs to be channeled in the right way. Secondly, there is a significant off-taker risk. The NGOs cannot commit to longer-term contracts because the camps are not supposed to be there long-term. Furthermore, the displaced persons are some of the most poor people in the world and often incapable of paying for the service. There are initiatives ongoing to mitigate this, and an example are cash programs which are emerging now hand in hand with distributed energy and distributed solar models. Number 3, there are many countries in Africa where the political and regulatory landscapes are challenging. And we've seen examples of projects that have been stopped after years trying to navigate the political and regulatory landscapes. I think also it's important to recognize that for the host countries, it's a threat that the camps and the displaced people could become permanent. So for this to become a solution where we see actually the accelerated deployment of solar, it needs to become part of the country's development plan, and it needs to be seen as a positive contribution to that development plan. Now, several stakeholders need to contribute for this to become a reality. The investors and the funding partners, they need to see this as an opportunity and then put in place the financial mechanisms to make it happen. We're already seeing some positive development in this area. The innovative finance, which is part of the global plan to action, is an example of...
In the end of the day, this is what it's all about. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you for this insight, and I can very much recommend everyone watching to go to the NORCAP website or use the link on this Facebook Live event to read the report. Now, let's turn to the panel with a very wide set of expertise within the field of energy, solar power, development aid, humanitarian relief, peace building, and politics, not to forget. Espen Barth Eide, Member of Parliament for the Norwegian Labour Party and Member of the Parliamentary Committee on Energy and the Environment. Sigrid Heiberg, Foreign Policy Spokesperson for the Norwegian Green Party. Mats Hansen, CEO of Kube Energy, a Norwegian renewable energy services company focusing on, well, hard-to-reach areas, to put it mildly. And Jan Egeland, Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugee Council. And with us on video from Nairobi, Sibi Lawson-Marriott, Senior Regional Advisor for Climate Adaptation, Resilience, Livelihoods, and Gender Equality at the World Food Programme in East and Central Africa. Welcome to you too, Sibi. Thanks for joining us. And I want to start with you, with your wide experience from the areas and contexts that this report really tries to deal with. If you could briefly try to help us understand what challenges the lack of electricity and clean and safe energy in general creates for the most vulnerable in the area you work with, and what untapped potential you see in a situation where these people could get access to energy.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Certainly.
Loud and clear?
Yeah.
Great, great. Thanks very much for this opportunity. As you mentioned, my name is Sibi Lawson-Marriott, and I work in the Regional Bureau of the World Food Programme. So I'm coming to you from Nairobi. I'm really happy we've managed to connect, and I want to use my time wisely. I thought this was a very useful report. It actually brought to light a lot of things that I wasn't aware of, and that many others, I'm sure, are not aware of. One of the things I thought was interesting was the fact that in sub-Saharan Africa, 16 countries are hosting 100,000 or more displaced people or refugees. Also interesting was that the writers of this report actually costed how much money it might cost to give these people access to energy. So much of the time, just costing things out is a big challenge. So that was really useful to know. So I really encourage everybody to go and read this report, echoing that. One of the things I wanted to do was just give you a few very quick user scenarios, needs, things that I thought the best thing would be to bring you from the field, just from a user perspective, the gaps that you might not be aware of. So I've worked for 20 years all over the continent of Africa in different contexts, humanitarian development, protracted crises. But I want to bring you this morning some examples from Ethiopia, which is where I worked most recently. Fascinating country for many reasons that many of you might be familiar with. One interesting thing about Ethiopia is up until very recently, it hosted more refugees than any other country in the world. Total open door policy, an island of stability in what can sometimes be quite a chaotic region. Of course, they do this under the international pact that they will keep their doors open for people to come in, and the international community will help them to sustain these people until they can go home or be settled. In 2019, interestingly, with a bit of unrest in the country, Ethiopia was home to more internally displaced people than any other country in the world as well. So the cost of this situation is enormous. It's enormous for the country hosting the refugees and the displaced population. It's enormous for the international community. And of course, it's enormous from the people who have the misfortune to be displaced. To put some numbers to that, for the food alone, in Ethiopia alone, there was a cost of $11 million a month. And that $11 million is going to provide only the most basic food and nutrition that you can imagine. And it's less and less available these days. And what that means is that often you don't get 11 million a month. You might get 9 million a month or 7 million a month. And when that happens, the food that goes to the refugees and their families gets reduced. We all know that the money for humanitarian response, such as supporting refugees, is not available much anymore. It's going down. And in Ethiopia, there were often times where all that was provided was the equivalent of, say, 1 or 2 slices of pizza per day. So really, resources are scarce. So what's happened is this system has reached breaking point for many reasons that we're not here to discuss today, but countries are less and less able to provide the support to the host governments. And the host governments, understandably, are starting to say, well, in that case, we're not going to be able to bring these refugees in. But it's a time of transformation, recognizing that this is no longer working. Many international partners, led by, notably, interestingly, your neighbors, Sweden and Denmark, are trying to make livelihood investments so that these refugees will have opportunities to make their own money, make their own livings. Governments who previously were reluctant to have refugees move around or settle have now removed all those restrictions and said, we will give them IDs, the ability to work. Of course, the refugees themselves have very different skills and sets of attributes that could work. But the unexpected block that these projects, which are on a big scale, to be commended, very forward thinking, the big block they're running into that wasn't expected is energy. Energy for irrigation, energy for education, energy to keep basic pumps moving, energy for training centers, energy for cell phones. So in your livelihood projects all over, where we're hoping this will be the exit strategy for the international community's responsibility for these refugees, they're hitting a snag that it's difficult to address. So energy keeps coming up in a gap here as a block to self-reliance for these people that we're talking about. That's case number one. Another case I'd like to share with you, the second one, is about nutrition. In Ethiopia, you have very high levels of stunting, and there was a great project that was going to provide poor families with a cash grant. It's free money, it's restricted, so it can only be spent on nutritious foods like fruits and vegetables, eggs, dairy, being implemented with the help of very good NGO partners in the government, and a lot of education about why this was important to do. And after a few months of implementation of this project, what they discovered was that these mothers, it targeted, by the way, mothers, pregnant women, young children, poor areas, mobile money, interesting. They found that the women were only buying onions and potatoes. And when they asked them why this was, they would say, well, we can't store them at home. Your papayas, your spinach, your leafy greens, all of that stuff, it goes bad. So they weren't buying it. They were trying to stretch their money. The retailers, who were often, by the way, small traders, women, they weren't able to stock large quantities of these nutrient-dense food because they don't have cold chain. They don't have storage. They don't need a lot of energy, but they need some. Once again, energy came up as one of the biggest blocks for this project. We know that as you move further away from the centers, from towns and cities, services overall decrease, but where we tend to work, WFP and our partners in very rural areas, there's almost no access to energy. That's come up as a threat again. My final explanation doesn't need much of a long story. It's just to say that we're very hopeful that a vaccine will be available for the COVID virus soon. And we know that once that challenge is passed, one of the biggest questions that's going to be, how are we going to have equitable access to everybody to get it? It won't work if only a few people have access to the vaccine. And we know from working on HIV that delivering this support, delivering access to these medicines is difficult in rural areas for unexpected reasons. One of the things we're flagging right now is cold chain for vaccine storage in rural areas. Where will it come from? We will need to set this up very quickly. So those were just a few of the user cases, and I'm sure we could find many, many, many more, and many are in the report. But the few thoughts that I wanted to leave you with, hopefully to spark some discussion is that the technology is moving so fast. It's only accelerating, but African countries, particularly sub-Saharan African, have shown an ability to leapfrog. We don't have to follow the same evolution. We have shown, particularly if you look at cell phones, one of the fastest growing cell phone populations in the world, a very young population that's willing to embrace new technology, that's increasingly concerned about their environment and sustainability. Where I live in Nairobi, we have one of the most progressive mobile money systems, and I live in an almost cashless economy. When COVID struck, companies were very quickly able to pivot to make incredible services available digitally, to make money truly cashless. So there's a lot of willingness to change. There's a young population, it's a tabula rasa. We have the opportunity to drive the direction of development in the ways that we want it to go, that's not always available. One of the challenges that we have, well, let me go back, sorry, private sector. This is a very interesting one for WFP, but for many UN agencies. We have an uneasy relationship with the private sector, if I can be diplomatic. There's often mutual suspicion, and I think it's on both sides about the motives of the private sector. And I think private sector often has an impatience with the multilateral system, with NGOs, with the consultation. Private sector has to go very fast, but we know only private sector can do certain things. We need to find a way to partner. Only private sector can bring out these technologies, can innovate, can use competition to establish which models are the best. And then perhaps the UN or NGOs can play the role of an honest broker. We know that these are populations that don't often have the opportunity to make a wide choice of technologies, and we want them to have access to the best. We know that we can have innovative ways of making it accessible and affordable. If we're providing a cash transfer for food, we can add to that transfer for energy. This can be a business model for burgeoning companies in the community. So different kinds of partnership. There are models that work that are out there, and we can share them. And I think BCG knows about a lot of them. Social enterprise models, public-private partnership models, where we can have blended partnerships that give us an impact that we all want. Governments are struggling in many countries, but in other countries, such as Ethiopia, they've shown a willingness to put the needed regulatory frameworks in place to safeguard investments. And we need to support communities to advocate for what they need from their governments. The one thing is that somebody mentioned that different actors have different timeframes, different budgeting, different approaches, different values. We need to align around the higher level shared collective outcomes. Yeah, let me stop there.
No, thanks, Sigrid. We'll get into some of these issues later, and I want to stick to some of your first points and follow up with you, Jan, because if we're focusing only on sub-Saharan Africa, there are 22 million refugees who lack access to energy. From the Norwegian Refugee Council's perspective, sort of give us an idea how that feeds into the conflict cycle, how that sort of keeps the poverty running and traps people in a situation that they can't get out of from your perspective.
Well, I mean, clearly the lack of energy, I mean, imagine we were out of energy here in this place. We would be paralyzed as productive people. So to have no access to clean energy, any energy in most places, means that people are locked in poverty, in misery forever. And then we travel to these places, and I've done that for 40 years now. And you see that there is this fantastic sun coming down 24/7, whole day, every day, for a whole year, basically, in the Sahara. And the one energy item that might be, for some, would be this diesel generator, which is noisy, terrible, and wasteful. So I'm so happy that the report is out and that NORCAP and BCG, NORCA, part of NRC, working with also our field programs, is now providing solutions. Because I think this report, to me, the one message is, yes, we can. This can change. For 40 years, I've been traveling and saying, how come we cannot get solar energy to people who have sun all the time. When it's a relatively easy investment, how come we're not getting solar energy to women who walk into dangerous woods for firewood and are routinely raped by armed militias when they could have solar energy for the cooking in the camp? I mean, it's easy in many ways. And what we need to find out is the solution, the investment, the way of doing it, because as humanitarians, it's difficult for us to take the leap. It is an investment, it needs organization, and it needs partners.
And I think both what you're saying and what Sibi was saying here is there are some surprising elements that go into the energy question, right? You mentioned rape cases. I mean, most people wouldn't think about solar energy and rape having anything to do with each other, but it's a huge issue, and there are other issues that you mentioned, Sibi, that are very surprising.
In Darfur, it was the one thing. I mean, the Secretary General in the UN was having many meetings about the women in Darfur who had to go to collect firewood. We ended up, the UN, by having, peacekeeping armored vehicles driving in front with 10 soldiers and then 3 women going behind to collect firewood. I mean, imagine bringing the energy to them. Or the kerosene stoves that I've seen in all of these huts routinely falling over and burning the children, beyond recognition. All of this can happen if we organize ourselves, invest it. We're trying to take the leap now in South Sudan with experts from NORCAP, the Norwegian Refugee Council program, and we are scheduled with a private sector partner to do completely away with diesel generators, because at the moment we truck diesel from Mombasa, Kenya, thousands of kilometers to South Sudan, Juba, and beyond, at great cost, hundreds and hundreds of tons, in a place with sun most of the time. So we're doing that transition now.
And that's where you guys come in, Mats. Kube Energy, you've decided to do something about this, basically. You have experience yourself from South Sudan, and you created a company that tries to sort of bring energy out to these vulnerable areas. Just give us a brief introduction. What are you guys trying to do, and what kind of challenges are you facing in doing this?
Yeah, so perhaps firstly I can say a little bit about sort of the company, because I think we're a little bit sort of unique and well placed to address this problem. So we were a group of people that previously worked in the UN within the humanitarian side and the peacekeeping side, and sort of saw the challenges internally for transitioning the operations from relying on diesel to more renewable sources. What we saw was that there was a sort of a lack of technical capacity to sort of look at non-traditional energy sources, and there was a lack of investment capital because of the annual sort of funding cycles of these organizations. So they chose diesel generators in our experience because they are cheap to buy, they're easy to install. The problem is that they're expensive to run, and they require constant maintenance. So the sort of end result is that a disproportionate amount of funding is spent on running diesel generators. So we established Kube 5 years ago with the ambition of seeing if we could leverage some of the private sector mechanisms to overcome some of these shortages, to attract some of the expertise from the private sector, and to use slightly more flexible funding mechanisms, where we didn't really have to take into consideration if the end users were peacekeeping, if there were humanitarians or development sort of actors. We could deploy capital wherever sort of the requirements for investors were met. Today we have established 3 large solar plants in South Sudan, where we have offered this these solutions on both power purchase agreements or leasing, where we sort of remove the technical and financial responsibility of operating these plants from the international actors. We think that these are ways of getting the scale of investments needed. Sibi mentioned sort of they have done a lot of calculations in the report. We think that perhaps these calculations are a little bit small. We think that to transition the sector away from diesel, billions of dollars is needed, and I think private sector is well placed to raise that funding and really sort of maybe use the international organizations as a point of departure for installing permanent infrastructure in these vulnerable areas.
But apart from financing, from money, of course, that you guys are concerned with, what are the main sort of concrete challenges that you meet when trying to set up?
I think in terms of partnership, I agree with Sibi that this is very often quite awkward. For the locations that we're talking now, they're the most remote areas of the world. There's no public infrastructure or ways of getting there without using either UN flights or things established for the international organizations. I think trying to find modalities where private sector can access these areas and using some of that infrastructure set up by, for example, the humanitarians. I think that Norway, as a big donor, can play a role in this and sort of mitigating and, for example, making special provisions in the logistics clusters. Another point is I think Norway has a great history of supporting development of sort of grid-tied energy projects with development funding. I think some of this funding can be used or should be used also in non-grid tied areas, so areas where there are refugees that are far away from the grids. A third point there is that with the off-taker risk that has been raised in the report, Norway is about to establish a guarantee fund or a guarantee mechanism for renewable energy investments. We think it's really important that this mechanism is also directed at and made relevant for areas where there are displaced populations, so that you can get the scale and the speed in these type of investments that is necessary.
Let's try to get back to that guarantee fund later. I mean, unfortunately, no one from the government is here, and that guarantee fund was sort of launched almost a year ago, and I don't know how much we've heard about it since, but we can get back into that. Sigrid, Mats mentioned here, Norway, big donor. And I guess for the Green Party, this is a no-brainer that Norway should spend a lot of money on green energy abroad. But take me through where you really see the chance for Norway to create some real policy with real impact in this area.
Well, I think, first of all, with what this report shows, right, is that solar power has great potential, and especially when it comes to places like these camps with displaced people, because solar is great for off-grid energy. I mean, for us in the Green Party, we of course want to go a lot further than the current government or previous governments on allocating funds, on making bigger state guarantees for Norwegian companies to invest in sustainable renewable energy in developing countries. We want to make the petroleum fund into a real green engine for green transformation internationally by giving the fund a new mandate that prioritizes profitable investments in low and zero emission solutions. We want to give at least 10 billion in support of the UN Green Climate Fund per year as part of the climate and nature percentage and so on. And that we want at least 1% of the national income to go to humanitarian aid and development aid. But I think that, I mean, what we're discussing here now, I feel like my role here today is to be the one who reminds us, because that is often why the Green Party is needed, to remind us of like the situation that we are in, because now we are talking about hundreds of millions of people lacking electricity in Africa. millions and millions of people who are internally displaced because of conflict for various reasons. And the latest reports on climate, they indicate that if global warming continues unchecked, which is the track that we are on now, within my lifetime, the heat in large part of the world is going to be completely unbearable, and there will be 3 billion people displaced in the world. So we are on track to a completely unimaginable disaster. By 2070, much of the world's population will live in areas that are not suitable for human life. So I think like the main point, we need to start off by acknowledging that if we do not turn our societies around, radically change our way of life, the way we run our societies, then large parts of our planet will be not livable in my lifetime, in the near future. So I think like that's the starting point, and which means that a lot of the way we run our societies at home, foreign policy, the way we invest abroad, the way we use our financial mechanisms is completely stupid. It doesn't make any sense what we are doing. So one of the things that we need to be doing is actually like completely change. We want to end the oil for development program and move to a green energy for development program, because that is where the future is, not only for this region, but for our region, for all regions of the world.
Espen, you've dealt with energy policy and foreign policy for many, many years. Where do you see Norway's sort of concrete contribution into the topics that this report touches upon? The need for investment, the need to cooperate, the need to get solar energy out to these areas?
I think we're just in the center of it, right? I think that Norway needs to use its experience in renewable, which we've had for many, many years because of our hydro power, which then means that we know quite a bit about how to run a renewable electricity system, although our energy mix is not all renewable, 50% is fossil, but we know a lot about building grids and all these things. And I think we need to put much more emphasis on it. More than any previous government, it has to be said that the previous government to this one put more money into it, but much more has to be done. I totally agree with that. In a sense, there's a piece of good news here. Of course, everything Sigrid says is right. The world is, either we change course or it doesn't work. It collapses completely. That's absolutely true. What's happening now is that we are slowly picking up speed. And business, investors, banks, more and more politicians, not all, are understanding that the future is renewable, circular, and sustainable, and that you need to align your technology development and your business with that reality. So the question is then, are we fast enough? Answer is obviously no, but things are happening. I mean, it's more this year than last year, more last year than the year before. These things are changing. A spin-off of the fact that solar will be probably the primary energy source in the world, then followed by wind and hydro and other renewable sources, is that there is so much technology development that leads to better solutions and lower prices, as we speak, by month. And that provides an opportunity for exactly those vulnerable societies that we're talking about, because there is an alternative now available, off the shelf in a sense, which does not pollute, which does not require complex and expensive logistic lines, which Jan very correctly pointed out. People engaged in humanitarian operations or in peacekeeping or vulnerable societies themselves spend a lot of money on fuel, which is much more expensive in the middle of a camp than in my local petrol station because of all the trouble of getting it there. So by eliminating that tomorrow is possible. And the good news about solar compared to other clean sources is that the first step is easy. You have no energy, then you put up a few solar panels, then you have some energy. If you add storage, which is also falling in price, you can have electricity 24 hours, not a lot. Then you can continue to build. You don't need to be on the grid yet, but you're ready to connect to the grid later. So if this becomes a permanent dwelling, well, it turns into a town, you connect it to the grid. If it doesn't, as hopefully we wouldn't like refugee camps to be permanent, you can take down the solar panels and move them somewhere else. You can't take down a hydropower dam. You can turn it off, but it's still there. So it's a very different animal. And in this world of bad news, more conflict, more humanitarian crisis, ecological, environmental disaster, this is one of the elements of good news. And I think Norway should go all in, because we have money, we have competence, we have expertise and experience, and we're credible in this field.
And you mentioned the expertise, but I went very briefly, like, could you be concrete on sort of the money side, for example? I mean, what could be done to sort of unwrap this knot, untie this knot that we're seeing right now, that Mats is talking about, that the report is talking about, where you're sort of hitting your head into a wall in trying to reach these areas and roll out?
So the thing is, if you're substituting something expensive with something less expensive, it's not only about more money, right? Of course, I'm in favor of more money, and that's on the record. In our budgets, we put more money, alternative budgets so far. We put more money into energy transition abroad, but it's not only about more money. It's all about organization and support and guarantees and making things happen. And you can actually get a lot done without colossal amounts of money. Because it's about the technology transfer, it's about organization, and it's also about helping vulnerable communities to stand up against the fossil mafias who will be trying to protect their old interest, because we know from every society that those who are strongest today are better organized than those who are strongest tomorrow. In democratic societies, there is a certain capacity, far from perfect, to fight that by thinking ahead. But of course, in non-democratic societies, the power of the incumbent technology is strong. So I've seen, and I talked to people in Indonesia, for instance, who actually believe that solar power is much more expensive than it actually is, because that's what the coal and oil people told them.
And the oil mafia, I guess we're also part of that, right? Norway. Sibi, as I want to hear from you just briefly, where do you see a country like Norway's role in trying to sort of get into these challenges that we see in the report and solve them?
Mm-hmm. I was smiling to myself, first wishing that I could vote for the Green Party in Norway, certainly, but unfortunately I won't be able to do that. But I think that it's important to get away from this idea that there are good guys and bad guys. And of course there are vested interests, but I was listening so keenly. It's so interesting to have this perspective on the internal discussions that Norway may be having as a country. What's needed as much as financial resources is the technology transfer. That is what is like gold. That is what can accelerate adaptation and change. So different roles for different players. That knowledge that Norway has about grids, about renewables is so valuable. That might be the main role, a catalytic role that Norway has. Perhaps then you can come into, when it comes time to get into a camp, that is a complicated business. And when our colleague was talking about what they've set up in South Sudan, what other options did those people have? I'm sure that Kube has the most state-of-the-art technology. I can see that their intentions are good, and you worked with the UN before, so you know that beast. But what if he wasn't that way? What if he was bringing a subpar technology? It's not just agency to organize against the oil mafia, but who is the advocate for the people that are receiving these technologies? This is not to say no one should try, but we know that the Southern Sudanese government will not do that. So how do we know this is the best technology? This is the best grid that will enable them to connect later. I very much support what our colleagues said about it's a progression. We don't have to boil the ocean all today, no. If we have seen people, small families with not a lot of money, who invest in very rickety little panels just to get that power to charge their phone. And then they'll charge their neighbor to charge their phone and make a little bit of money and buy some green leafy vegetables or whatever it is with it. So it's a progression, different roles for different players. Ultimately, in many of the countries where we're going to see the successes that are going to give you the evidence, I think it's Sigrid, to say, look, this is making a positive difference. People want evidence. That's going to come from countries like Kenya and Ethiopia and Tanzania and Rwanda that do have governments that will safeguard your investments. It's only these governments that will be able to take things to scale, but it is only us as an international community who will hold them accountable for doing so. We have a collective responsibility to hold the private private sector accountable to, and so on and so forth. But different roles for different players would be a very important message, and that the time is now. It's a time of transformation. We cannot continue. We will either adapt or we will die. And part of that adaptation is these easy technologies.
But do you agree, Sibi, that, for example, a guarantee fund where Norway could set up some money that would guarantee investments in solar energy, would that help sort of give a boost to the development?
We need a proof of concept, and that is only possible when you have catalytic investors. Someone spoke of de-risking earlier those investments, and I don't know a lot about that, but I know that it takes someone to say, I don't need to see my profit for 10 years. My shareholders will need a profit, but I don't need it tomorrow. That's where the private sector usually runs. As someone mentioned, the time cycle to see the returns that you want are going to take time. I don't know, maybe this is not a way to make quick money, but it is a way to drive change. It doesn't have to cost everything, but who are the visionaries who have that appetite? We can help manage the risk. We can show where the need seems to be greatest. We can give voice to the people who are saying what they would like to do. They have skills, ideas, business models, but they don't have the energy for it. Norway can help with that. Once you have a proof of concept, governments are willing to take things to scale.
Quickly from Espen.
Very quick. I totally agree with Sibi. I think the key message is that what states can do, like ours, is to de-risk, think long-term, and give a guarantee backup to business people who are actually there for return on investment, but you make it more likely that they don't fail through the guarantee. And then you make things happen who will not happen without the guarantee. But if you don't pay it, you have actually not spent any money, and you can give a guarantee again. This is the ideal use of development money, that it catalyzes change without actually spending much.
Yeah, and what we need now is, of course, a few big bangs in some places. It's incremental progress, many places, but we should have a few models. I mean, maybe we could use South Sudan. A lot of things are happening there. 2, 3 other countries, and would require a number of things. Of course, the funding is essential. Some of these funds for the climate that I've been discussing for 20 years. I mean, the green funds here and there, and it produced more seminars than big progress on the ground. We need, and I think the report in a way gives a sketch to how it could happen. We need 2, 3 countries where the humanitarian country team, including World Food Programme, big organization, big NGOs like NRC, the development people, the peacekeeping mission, agree, let's pool resources. Then we have some private sector coming in, helping us, and they say, okay, we'll fix it in the next 6 months, and you can pay us back over 5 years. And then we have the government saying, yes, okay, it costs 100 million NOK in South Sudan, we're willing to advance that, for example. That kind of a concrete plan on the ground is needed in the next few months. I mean, I pledged solemnly to make NRC carbon neutral within few years. And I need action, really. I need from myself, but also from my environment, because if we're alone, we will not succeed.
Mats?
Yeah, no, I think it's a good point. And with regards to proof of concept, I think there are models out there that work at the moment. I mean, I like to.
You're sitting right here.
Boast my own projects, but I think the Malakal project does provide a very interesting model. I think it's a model that works for a fragment of the actors in Malakal. I think it's set up to provide mainly electricity to the humanitarian and international organizations present there. It has limited impact on the population outside. I think that's where, when we speak to investors, it's difficult to make that from a purely capital perspective, but where I think the added investment from an agency like NORAD to extend the grid cables out to the local population, it would be relatively small compared to the overall size of the actual plant that is there. When it comes to sort of having some trust in the private sector, I think that when you look at the timelines mentioned in the report, that 60% of organizations and populations should be required or provided with clean electricity within 5 years. I think that does require some sort of aggressive policies to achieve that. And I think that it's important also to take some risks and to allow a variety of actors to come in and set up models that if you can see that it's successful one place, maybe you can sort of expand that to other places. But I think with just the timelines involved, it requires that it's sort of a basic amount of trust and sort of, I think, inviting in the private sector to play a big role in the development.
Sigrid, briefly.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the last speakers, but, because I think that a key thing here is about de-risking and making sure that there are also private sector money that is willing to go into these projects. But of course, these temporary camps is the crux of the problem, right? Because to invest in solar, you need a first-time investment, and then your running expenses are low. So the whole point is that these camps are temporary, so often that investment doesn't make sense. Often the humanitarian sector doesn't have a long enough perspective, so then you stick with your diesel generator, which is very expensive to fuel. But I just want to say that one positive thing here is that even if you don't manage to, go completely solar or very big solar, even a small, if you get some solar, that means that your other fuel, like your diesel generators, you will be more resilient to disaster, to problems in these areas, because you will have longer access to your fuel.
Sibi, just super quick.
Super quick, just to say, while the permanence of the camps and other political considerations is an obstacle, we shouldn't let it stop us, because these solutions are also needed in other low-income areas often around the place. But that's
I'm saying super quick, I'm sorry, because there's one more issue I just want to touch upon before we wrap up this panel, and it's the little elephant in the room that the report is also mentioning, talking about the triple nexus. Cooperation between the development, humanitarian, and peace-building sectors. And I think a lot of people are not involved with NGOs, international NGOs. Maybe it's a surprise that these are three very different sectors, and they don't sort of talk to each other. They think in silos. Why is that an issue in this regard? And sort of try to be concrete and brief. How can we solve that? You said, Jan, they should agree. Let's talk to each other. Well, that's easier said than done. You have a lot of experience from the sector. How do you see it?
Well, it's easy said and easy done, actually, but it needs leadership from the top. Including the UN is leading both the humanitarian sector, the development sector, and the peacekeeping sector. So the special representative of Secretary General need to provide command from the saddle here. The resident coordinator exists, etc. And then we can be, agitators inside. The problem is really that the humanitarians who are on the ground, we're massively on the ground. In places, the development people and others, and the World Bank and the International Financial Institution, they don't even go there. But we are really trying to survive the next few months, basically. We have one-year budgets, and we are overwhelmed by the crisis of the day. The development actors are the ones who could do these 2-year plans, 3-year plans, and help provide the funding. And then we pool resources in the sense, I mean, how many Toyotas are roaming around in South Sudan? Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, if we look at all of the actors having this together. Investment from all of us together would solve it in an instant with good donors, and I'm sure that the two parties here will convince all of the others to have this investment.
Espen, from your experience, why is that so hard, and how can we make a change in this regard?
There are entire books being written on this dilemma, and I've written some of them and worked with Jan on that in one of my previous incarnations. It's extremely complex. It's seemingly easy, let's just talk together, but then there are different mandates, and then there are different reasons you're being there. There are actually even reasons why you shouldn't mix everything together, because humanitarian is not developmental, and development is not exactly the same as political change. So these are complex issues. But what I do notice is that the energy and the climate dimension, both of them, energy and climate, are now much more integrated into thinking than it used to be, for instance, 15 years ago when Jan and I worked on this, trying to reform the UN's approach to this through what was called ECHA. And so I think there is a much better understanding that you have to factor in this dimension. I would like to say that we need still to distinguish between what is short to middle term solutions to a camp, for instance. It's not exactly the same as building a long-term community, and we need to be clear about that and see how we can sort of deal with that dilemma. Because, as I said, the step from no energy to some energy can today very easily be done with solar power. The step to a modern advanced society, which is also very renewable, is perfectly doable, but much more complex because it requires a very high level of organization and trust, not only engineers, but political organization that lasts over time. Otherwise, it's much easier to fire up a coal plant. So I think in the development part of this discussion, and in that end, I think to not only look at technology, but how technology is actually applied, how you connect, how you create long-term agreements will be a very important part, and we know something about that in this country and in Europe, because Europe is doing this. And I think we need to apply this, and I'm happy to say that my next event today is Nordfund's conference, which is about the same. It's called Building Back Cleaner, Greener, and Better. And it's also about how to use development fund for these kind of changes.
Sibi, finally, a brief perspective on that point from you.
We can do multi-year planning that has shorter cycles within it. We are able to align if we have to. So it's hard to do, but it can be done. That's it from me.
Thank you. Our time is up, and I would like to say thank you to all of you. And it's obvious that making sure that the most vulnerable get access to clean and safe energy not only fulfills an SDG and helps people get out of poverty, but it also it's a truly necessary step to make sure that we reach the goals we set in the Paris Agreement to avoid catastrophic climate change and to mitigate its consequences. So thank you again, Espen, Barth, Eide, Sigrid, Heiberg, Mats Hansen, Jan Egeland, and Sibi Lawson-Marriott for taking the time. And thanks to all of you watching. Please download and read the report and take action based on what you read. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.